Hi everyone, I'm Natalia Perez, and today I'll be talking about the bubonic plague. Now, what is the bubonic plague? The bubonic plague is a disease expressed by its causative agent, Yersinia pestis. Now, what this Yersinia pestis is, it's a zoonotic disease that can be spread between both humans and animals. It is a bacterium with a cocobacillus shape over here. And as seen over here, it is also gram-negative, a facultative anaerobe, non-motile, and is a mesophile that can grow within a time period of 24 to 72 hours. The bubonic plague is one of three types of clinical plague expressed by this bacterium. The two other most common are septicemic plague and pneumonic plague. Now, the pathogenesis of Yersinia pestis. In its initial stage of infection, Yersinia pestis can enter both macrophages and neutrophils through the mechanisms of active and passive entry. Neutrophils are really good at killing the bacteria within its initial stage, but Yersinia pestis has really good adaptation features against the phagocytosis of macrophages, and once ingested can live within the bigger vacuoles of macrophages, which causes later on in the late stage infection for infected macrophages to be carried off to major organs such as lymph nodes, the liver, and the spleen. And once it arrives at these organs in late stage infection, it causes it enforces the macrophage to undergo lysis and allows the Yersinia pestis to exit and exponentially multiply extracellularly, causing these previously mentioned cells and to engorge and further engorge the previously mentioned organs. Now, why is it so effective as a disease? The biggest feature, as previously mentioned, is its extremely fast incubation period. The fastest cases have been reported of incubating within host cells are 24 to 48 hours, so not even the full 3-day mark. And it has these really adaptive adhesive proteins that allows it to exhibit phagocytogenic adaptations, and later on within infection, after it's been engulfed by the macrophage, it further expresses 6 different effector proteins, these 6 listed over here, that further inhibit the innate immune system responses, and also just fully cuts off innate immunity responses such as inflammation and cell signaling between the immune cells, which can easily also cut off and kill other cells such as natural killer cells and dendritic cells. And because it is also effective at cutting off communication between dendritic cells, it can essentially stop adaptive immunity before it even happens. Here's a diagram that better illustrates the pathway of Yersinia pestis by its initial vector flea and its flea bite, all the way down to how it stops inflammatory and cytosine activity, and it effectively stops adaptive immunity. So the symptoms of bubonic plague. Within the first 24 hours of infection, you start to exhibit very aggressive but apparently normal fever symptoms, such as a high core temperature, breathing issues, adverse seizures, and gangrene. But after the 24-hour incubation period, swollen lymph nodes or buboes start to appear, and that's what the bubonic plague is named after, the swollen buboes. And those appear mostly within around the armpit, groin, and neck. Now, this is a really good artistic rendition of the most commonly visually distressing symptoms. As you can see, the buboes around the groin and the gangrene. Modern treatments, thankfully, are extremely effective against the bubonic plague. There is a vaccine, but because it is so easily, but because the bacterium is so easily killed off by these antibiotics, the antibiotics are the most common recommended form of treatment. The selection of antibiotic therapy is extremely important because over-the-counter antibiotics can't do anything to it. The most common form of prevention between health organization to health organization is the recommendation of killing off any pests, especially fleas and rodents, to avoid potential exposure or being bitten by them or airborne transport. So kill off those pests in the backyard, guys. Here is a graph provided from the CDC that shows each individual reported cases of a bubonic plague victim in the United States in the year 2020. As you can see, right now, nowadays, it happens mostly in rural areas where there should be a lot of cattle, a lot of rural life, a lot of open spaces, and a lot of wild animals. And here are all the reported cases between the years 2019 to 2020 with worldwide. Now, a brief history of the bubonic plague. The bacterium Yersinia pestis was first discovered by the French bacteriologist André Yersin, and he discovered this while on a research trip to Hong Kong when there were a lot of cases of bubonic plague popping up everywhere. It was later isolated in the same year by Kitasato Shibasaburo, a Japanese physician and bacteriologist. And due to his efforts, we were able to further study this bacterium. It wasn't until 2 years later when an anti-serum was finally in working development by the Russian-born bacteriologist Waldemar Mordecai Hafkin. And thanks to his efforts, anti-serum was able to be relatively quickly produced and shipped off to places like Hong Kong and India. The most common, but it actually wasn't until 2 years after that when the most common mode of transmission was finally discovered by the French physician Paul-Louis Simond. He was the one who was able to pinpoint that it was fleas and rodents that were acting as the main vector. There were three major epidemics of bubonic plague throughout history, even though it existed centuries before that. But the three most horrific cases were one, the Justinian plague that started in the 500s during around the Mediterranean basin, and it infected people as far as the northern territories of Europe, such as English and French territories. The second and most commonly known case is the Black Death epidemic from the 1340s, all around but petering off around during the 1340s, all around but petering off around the 18th century. The third case, which is lesser known and doesn't have any fancy name, but the third case is called the third plague pandemic, which was the one that was previously mentioned with Alexander Yersin and Dr. Kitasato. So, the Black Death epidemic was one, if not the most devastating global epidemic of the bubonic plague that struck Eurasia around the 1340s. The Yersinia pestis bacterium first emerged in 1346 in Mongolia and was quickly spread through the efforts through rats and other fleas getting on transport systems such as ships and cargo carriages. It didn't hit Europe full force until January of 1348, when a different strain of it arrived at the shores of Genoa. And funny enough, but people were already aware of this great pestilence that was taking place and sweeping across Asia, and they tried to ward off. It was so bad that they were actually trying to ward off ships entering Genoa, but by the time they arrived, it was already too late. The plague started petering out during the 1350s, but that was most likely due to a combination of quarantine efforts and the fact that people in the millions were already killed off. And it wasn't until the 1353 where a lot of researchers and historians have considered that the Black Death epidemic was essentially at its end point or its low point. But that was mostly to the fact that, as previously mentioned, millions were killed off. Now, the estimate of how many people exactly in Europe died due to the Black Death epidemic varies between historians and researchers, but a rough mean estimate of people in the continent of Europe alone that died was essentially 25 million, which at the time roughly estimates the 30 to 50% of the population in Europe. It was so horrific that the population in Europe did not reach its pre Black Death levels until the 16th century in population. Now, one of the most commonly known visuals that popped out of the Black Death epidemic was the creation of the plague preventive costume, or the plague doctor. Now, here's a stylized rendition of what the plague doctor essentially looked like, but what in its first conception, it looked something somewhat closer to this. It was not all black. It was more frumpy, red. Still made of leather though. Still somewhat effective still somewhat really effective in keeping off main vectors like fleas and rats, and keeping off airborne transmission, but nothing too fancy. The ones that we see now popularized in media were made popular by 17th to 18th century Italian macabre theater and carnival renditions of it, where it was meant to display more of like, or essentially play more of like an omen of death. Here is a more accurate real life example of what the plague doctor mask looked like. Really not the sharpest, but effective for its time. The plague preventive costume was proposed or created by the French royal court physician Charles de Lorme, and he was the one who conceived the uniform during the 17th century, in the early 1600s actually. So centuries after the initial Black Death epidemic took place. Really well known, really well-known physician during his time. There were plague cases popping up around France too, and he was the one who essentially made the first, as previously mentioned, who essentially conceived the plague doctor uniform. Anyway, so that's all I have to say. Thank you so much, and stay healthy, guys.